So my name is Josh Brothheim, and I'm going to be leading today's presentation of the Sumo Logic QuickStart Level 1 certification. So let's go ahead and jump in and just start rolling through this. So I'm just going to switch screens here. So we're going to be going over the Level 1 certification. These are going to be the steps that will teach you about how to become a pro user. There'll be an exam that corresponds with this, and I'll talk about the certification program a little bit later. So what are we going to be talking about over the next hour or so? We're going to be talking about 5 things in no particular order. Actually, they are in particular order. I take that back. So what we're going to be going over is how does Sumo Logic help me? We're going to go through a demo and give you a real-world example of how Sumo Logic can be beneficial, just one of the ways. We're going to talk about what data is available to you. So you get access to Sumo Logic, and now you need to begin utilizing it. You need to be able to find what data is available to in the system, and I'll show you a couple different ways to get there. We're going to show you how searching, parsing, and analyzing your data is going to be beneficial. Basically, how you can take now that all that data is in the system, how you can start to query it and start to parse those fields out and ultimately analyze it. How can you monitor trends and critical events? We'll take a look at that. And then we'll talk about the next steps. Where do I go from here? So let's go ahead and dive in. So how does Sumo Logic help me? And I should add before I start rolling here. If any questions come up, feel free to post them in the chat. I'll try and take a look at them periodically. We'll also have a question and answer session towards the end. So there'll be a couple opportunities for you guys to ask some questions. But let's go in and actually start with the demo first. So let me get my demo set up here. And there's part of it, and I'll get the other part up in a second. But so what I want to go through here is a scenario. And what this scenario, oops, sorry about that. And what I want to do in this scenario is, if you envision that there's a company called Travelogic, our sister company, fictional example, but let's pretend it's a real world one for today. And we have a production website where users can go and book travel, similar to other websites that you've used out there before, I'm sure. You can go in, you can look for a flight, look for a car, find the best deal, book your flight, and then ultimately feel free to travel. So this site is revenue generated. When people book tickets, we get money, essentially. And so what is happening right now is I just got a call from my manager saying people are having a problem checking out of the Travelogic website. If they can't check out, that means they can't book flights. We don't get revenue. They get annoyed. It's bad customer service experience. And so the goal is to figure out what's going on and how to resolve it. At about the same time, I get a message. Here it is, actually good. Let's see, where's the most recent one? Here it is. So I get a message a few moments ago saying that monitor alert on critical travel app high node CPU. So at this point, I have 2 pieces of information. I know that people can't check out, and there's some issue with the CPU usage going on. And that's it. My job is now to figure out what's going on, and more importantly, resolve it. And so how am I going to do that? So I'm going to utilize Sumo Logic to help me with that. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the Sumo Logic console. And I'm specifically going to go ahead and jump in, and let me refresh this panel, into a dashboard view. And what this dashboard view is going to show me, and it's just loading, I'll just take a second, there we go, is it's showing me operational overview information about a variety of different services and things that are going on within the Travelogic environment. So even if I'm not very technical, I can see here that there's been reporting nodes, reporting information, ELB information, checkout service, database issues, etc. And like I said, even if I'm not that technical, just by looking at these panels, green is good, red is bad. And so over here with the checkout service, I see almost 3,000 errors in the last 60 minutes. Well, I know people can't check out. There's errors with the checkout service. This seems to be the right path to go down into investigating this further. So let's go ahead and do so. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the sub panel, and this is now service details, which is showing more details about the services that are going on within Travelogic. And I have a couple graphs that are going to help me out here in displaying what's going on. And ultimately, remember, the goal is still, of course, to figure out what happened and how to resolve it. But so the first one here on the top left, I have bookings. So this is showing me over the last 60 minutes the amount of bookings that have taken place in the Travelogic environment. And so what I see is prior to about about 8:55 local time, Pacific time, I see people were successfully able to book travel, not necessarily flights, but travel of some sort. And so the green is indicating successes, the red is, the orange rather, excuse me, is fail. And so I see success, 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 and then once again, about 10, 15 minutes ago, I see an orange and a bunch of fails started to happen. Well, those fails are kind of corresponding to the time the checkout service went down, the time my manager called me, the time I got the Slack message. So it looks like something happened at around 8:55. Okay, we're getting there. Now I have a little more information. Now I know there's something wrong with the checkout service, and something happened or didn't happen at about 8:55. Over here, I have errors for the last 7 days. And what this is showing me is over the last 7 days, in the last 60-minute window, so essentially from 8:08 local time to 9:08 local time, for today, for yesterday, for the day before, etc., the amount of errors that have occurred. And so what I see here is actually no errors have occurred over the last 60 minutes, over the last 7 days, except once again at about 8:55, 8:53 or so, errors started to occur today, and only today. So that's good to know. It shows me that today was a bit of an anomaly. Normally during this time there are no errors. Today there are. So that's, once again, just kind of also confirming something is going on or not going on. Gateway latency over here. What this is showing me is information about gateway latency. And so what I see here is a threshold has been determined where latency is considered to be acceptable. So some latency is going to occur. That's kind of a fact. But what we can determine is when that latency gets outside the norm. So what I see here, once again, is latency was pretty normal, so it was within the acceptable range, acceptable. And then once again, about 8:54, 8:55, 8:53, the threshold for the latency spiked, which is indicated by the pink triangle representing an outlier. And then I see that acceptable range increase. So once again, 8:53, 8:54, something happened to the gateway latency that caused it to increase more than expected. And then finally, we have a CPU and total memory metrics panel. And what this is showing here is information about CPU and total memory. And so what I see here is, once again, things were running pretty level or consistent. And then we see this line right there, the orange one. And once again, around 8:54, 8:53, something happened that caused this checkout line to spike. So that's interesting. That's about the time that things went wrong. So let's go ahead and look into that a little more detail. So I'm going to look at the metrics associated with CPU and total memory. And so now I'm zooming in specifically on the metrics. And what I see here now are the metrics associated with CPU and total memory. So it's basically that graph just expanded out a little bit. And so what I see here is CPU information and memory usage information. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn off the memory usage because the Slack message I got was referencing CPU. I think there's something related to CPU, so I'm going to just turn off the memory because it's just adding some kind of additional noise to my graph. Not much, but a little bit. It cleaned up a tiny bit. So once again, I see this metric spike that at about this time, CPU usage was going crazy, but I don't know why yet. I'm just seeing what's going on here. And so what I can now do is bring in the logs to see if there's anything going in the logs that's going to give me an indication of what was taking place during this time period. And actually, I should have shown one other service detail dashboard, so I'm actually going to jump into it now. It's not too late. And I'm going to go to this error by nodes. I should have shown this one. And what this one is showing is the amount of errors that have taken place over the last 60 minutes. And so we see here, not many errors, bunch of errors over here. And if we look at the source name, we see CS team travel-checkout. Well, that's just kind of corresponding that there's something wrong with the checkout service and related to possibly the logs related to checkout service. And that's where we're going to dig in a little bit deeper. So I'm going to go back to my metrics here. And what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to bring in the logs associated with this time period. So I'm going to say, all right, I want to look at all the CS team travel checkout logs. The other thing I want to do is I want to look at all the errors that were occurring with those or within those logs over the last hour. So I'm going to just say, look for the string of error and hit enter. At this point, it's now combining into a unified logs and metrics environment. And so now what I see in the top here in this is a heat map indicator, is the frequency or the occurrence of those strings of error, particularly related to checkout service over the last hour. And so what I see in here is there were actually no errors taking place, once again, about 8:55, 8:54. The heat map is white or blank, so indicating no errors took place. And then about 8:50, 8:54, errors start to take place. And we can see in the heat map, the darker the color, the more frequent or the greater occurrence of errors. And so we see here a lot of errors, a little less errors, and it's starting to kind of die off over here. So what I'm going to do now is drill into one of these sections so I can go ahead and look at the logs now that correspond to that section, which are broken out into 1-minute time periods. So I did a shift click on the 1-minute time period, and now I'm looking at the logs that are associated with those with that time period. So now we're looking at logs from 8:55 to 8:56 local time, and particularly for the string of error. And what I see in here are, well, a lot of errors. So here's an error. It's telling me error SSL routine, get server certificate. So it looks like just from the error, there's something wrong with the server certificate, which is good to know. And then I see some other errors in here. Errors checking out or processing credit payment. A couple more errors. So a bunch of errors. Actually, specifically, there's 283 errors for just this minute. Now I'm trying to figure out what caused these errors and also how to resolve them. And so bit of an assumption here, but I've done this demo a few times, so I can make this assumption, is that I want to expand my search out in two different ways. The first is I don't really just want to see the errors that occurred in this past minute. I actually want to see everything that occurred in this past minute, because what caused the errors was most likely not an error itself. Something happened or didn't happen, and then a bunch of errors were triggered. So I'm going to get rid of the string error, so I look for everything related to logs. The other thing is I don't want to just look at the time period from 8:55 to 8:56 local time, because that's once again showing me when those errors were occurring. I want to go ahead and look further back so I can see what happened, what caused those errors. So I'm going to say, look at the last 60 minutes, because I know over the last 60 minutes, there were times when there were no errors and there are times where there were. So I can look at the last 60 minutes and start to formulate a picture. And we're going to go ahead and do that right now. So I'm going to click start. And so now my search is expanded out, and my results are going to go from 283 to almost 55,000, because I'm looking for all that data over the last hour, regardless of if there were errors or not. And so, like I said, I now have 55,000 messages, 2,200 pages of messages. Now, I could go ahead and start to manually scan through these and try to find what caused the errors, but that's really just not a good use of time going through 2,000 pages or 55,000 log messages. And so since we have a great system like Sumo, we can take advantage of it. So the first feature I'm going to take advantage of is log reduce. And what log reduce is going to do is it's going to take all 55,000 messages and look for common trends or patterns within those log messages and group them together. And so let's go ahead and do that. And so right now it's taking those 55,000 messages and it's looking for pattern matching or recognition within them. And so it's going, and it'll take a few seconds here. So go ahead and let it do its thing. And here it's loading now. It'll take another moment or two, but while it's finishing up, I can talk to it. So as it continues, what it's doing here is it's grouping these messages. So we see that there's 3,000 messages that have this format with the transaction ID. There's almost 3,000 messages that have starting cart checkout process, and so on and so forth. And so we see a lot of messages that have those common patterns, which are positive indications of a successful transaction. So I see here, oh, they're finished. There's been almost 9,000 transaction IDs. Well, that's good. If there's transaction ID, probably people are able to check out, so that's a good indication. Now, keep in mind, I'm looking at the last 60 minutes, and we know that there were a lot of good things happening as well as bad things. So to see these positive transaction ID, charging credit via gateway, these are all positive indications of a successful checkout. But like I said, we're looking for those things that happen less frequently that cause the errors. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to take my log compare or my log reduce, excuse me, and I'm just going to flip it around. So rather than looking at something that happened 8,000 times, 7,000 times, I want to flip it around so I can look at those things that happen less frequently and see if they're interesting or relevant. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is just flip my count around. So rather than looking at most frequent, look at less frequent. And so what I have now here at the very first line, I have date info, travel logic app, starting cluster, checkout. Okay, well, that's good. Checkout is what we were interested in. Version 1.14 dev. Well, why is it development code? So we were on a production server. Oh, somebody made a mistake. They pushed the wrong version of code to a prod server. As a result, since it was the wrong type of code, it wasn't able to read the server certificates properly and resulted in all those checkout errors. And so that's kind of the bigger reveal, the big ta-da. And so what we were able to do there is use Sumo to help us troubleshoot. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the slide deck to help us kind of catch up on what we were just doing. So I have a couple slides that correspond with it. And so here's what we just did or looked at in that presentation or that demo. The first portion was we used the alerts. So the alerts are really helpful in notifying us of a critical event and notifying us of a critical event while not necessarily sitting in Sumo Logic clicking the query button every 30 seconds or every minute. We could go ahead and get a Slack message and be notified when we're sitting outside Sumo Logic. We can have the dashboard presented in a big command center or a NOC environment and use the very simplistic idea of red bad, green good, so that if somebody's walking by and has a question or wants to know what's going on with the services, just looking at the dashboard is going to be sufficient. It's going to give them an indication of what is not going on, as the case may be. So that's certainly going to be very helpful. You're going to go ahead and utilize the metrics, or we did at least in that demo, which helped us identify what was going on. And what was going on was that CPU spike, the failed checkouts, and then we used the logs to identify why it's happening. So combining that log and metrics environment into a unified solution, we were able to identify the why was because the wrong version of code was pushed out to the production server. So as far as Sumo Logic data flow, this is going to be helpful to understand how data flows through Sumo Logic and how it gets there. The first step is data collection. We're not going to go into data collection too much today. In fact, this will be about the only discussion about it, although I do have one more slide. If you're interested in the data collection side of things, that would be level 3, Sumo Power Admin. So I would encourage you to attend that webinar, which will be I believe next Thursday. We're doing that one. But so the first step is data collection. Very simplistic view, your data is out there and it needs to be brought to Sumo Logic. So whether it's out there on the internet, whether it's out there on a private network, on a personal device, or anywhere in between, ultimately for Sumo Logic to help you with that data, it needs to be brought into Sumo Logic, which I think makes sense. So that first step is just the collector is that piece of software, or you don't even always need to use a piece of software, but is that mechanism that's grabbing those logs and bringing them into Sumo Logic. Step 2, you now have those logs sitting in Sumo Logic, and now you need to do something with them. And that's where searching and analyzing comes in. So using the operators, and we'll go through some of them today, using the charts to display the results, you'll be able to go ahead and start to make sense of your data and analyze it. And then step 3 is visualizing and monitoring. So kind of as I mentioned earlier with those alerts and dashboards, providing mechanisms for users both inside your organization and outside it to still get an understanding of what is going on in the Sumo Logic environment without running queries. So like I mentioned, having those alerts set up so that you get an email or you get a Slack message when something good or something bad happens, or the dashboards are set up so that, just at a glance, you can see what's going on. Those are going to be very helpful. Cool. Let's go ahead. And so I did mention the collectors. This is kind of an overview screen of Sumo collectors and how they work and how they bring data into Sumo. Don't get bogged down on this slide. Just wanted to show kind of regardless of where your data is, it can be brought into Sumo Logic. So maybe you have your data sitting in S3 or AWS. Maybe it's in the Google Cloud platforms. Maybe it's local behind a firewall. Regardless of where it is, you can bring it into Sumo. It's just what mechanism you're going to utilize to bring it into Sumo. Like I said, that's a kind of a level 3 thing that we will discuss more next week. Metadata is worth discussing because it's going to be a really helpful way for you to locate your data. So when data gets ingested into Sumo Logic, there are going to be tags that are associated with each log message. And so by default, there are some that are set up automatically, like the collector name, like source host, source name, etc. What you can do, and what we're going to encourage you to do, is to use the source category as your primary metadata tag. And the reason being, it's going to be a name or a tag that can be customized by you in the naming convention. And by providing a strong or smart naming convention, you can make it very easier for your users to locate their data. Once again, this is more of a level 3 thing as well, but it's going to be really critical that you do name your data with something that makes sense. And we'll look at some source categories in a few minutes when we get into some more demo work, so we'll get into that. So what data can you analyze? So let's go through the scenario. You're new to Sumo Logic. You now have access to Sumo Logic, and you're told, get to work. Well, where are you going to start? The first thing you're going to start with is determining what type of data is available to you. And I'm going to show 2 different ways to analyze your data or to find your data. Now, ideally, the primary method would be to have somebody tell you, hey, our data is located here. That would be easy and would be nice, but that isn't always going to occur. So let me show you a couple options, and let me go ahead and jump into the UI. So what we're going to do here is, let me go ahead and pull this up. Okay, so what I'm doing now is I'm just jumping into the UI, and I'm going to go ahead and, there we go, screen's expanded, that should be good. And let me go ahead and show you, like I said, two different ways to go ahead and see what data is available. So the first is, and this is assuming you have access to do so, is to go to Manage Data on this black bar and go to Collection. And what the collection is showing, and I mentioned the collectors just a moment ago, this is showing all the data that's being ingested and all the collectors that are set up to get that data and bring it into Sumo Logic. So we see here that here's some AWS data and some Azure data and some more AWS data since it's in alpha order, Azure, more Azure, and et cetera. We have 22 pages worth of data in here. And so what you could do is you can start to look through the collectors to see, is your data available? If it is, and let's actually go ahead and search for a source category that I'm using, or a type of data that I'm going to be playing with, which is Apache data. So let's see, do we have any Apache data in here? We do. And so here we have labs Apache data, which is what we'll be playing with in this demo. Also, if you go ahead, or when you go ahead and do the lab work, you'll be using this source category as well. And what I see from this screen is the type of collector is hosted versus installed. Like I said, more of a level 3, so kind of ignore that for now. And what I see over here is a graph recognizing that there has been data loaded within the past hour. So I know that there's current data and roughly about 255,000 messages over the past hour. And here's where I see the source categories that have been set up, which is going to be a really nice way for me to identify my data. So here I see lab Apache access data, lab Apache error data, labs index errors. And so by using a good naming convention, I am able to identify my data. Also, I can go ahead and start to use this data, or this naming convention, to help me differentiate from data. For example, this is my lab data, here's my demo data. And so I can use that top level of the source category, the top component, to provide an indication through that naming convention of what data is relevant to me. So that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is to go ahead and just do a query. So I'm going to go ahead and do a new log search. And I'm going to create a query. The query is going to be very simple, but it's a query nonetheless. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say look across all my data. Now I'm specifically looking at my data over the last 15 minutes, but I'm looking at all my current data that's being ingested. The next line I'm saying count by source category. And so what I'm requesting from the system is to go through all my data over the past 15 minutes and do a count by source category of the types of different data that I have. So let's go ahead and click start. It's going to take a second or two. And then it's brought back our data. So let me go ahead and sort this in a count order, because right now it's in kind of a random order. So let me just go ahead and specify top to bottom. And what I see here, and it's actually still loading, but I'll go ahead and chat about it anyhow, is the different source categories with the greatest amount of data. So I see here there's a lot of VMware data. There's a lot of Puppet access data, a bunch of Apache access data, Kubernetes, Docker, Linux data, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm able to see, there's a lot of different data in here that I might want to take advantage of. And like I said, we'll go ahead and start playing with this Labs Apache access set of data in a moment. But this was showing you just two different ways that you can go ahead and find what data is available to you in the system. Let's go ahead and jump back to the slide deck. So how can I analyze that data? So you've now gone ahead and located your data, or somebody has told you where your data is located, and now how can you start to analyze it? And I'm going to show you two ways that you can do so before even writing a query. So this is going to be, once again, kind of easy ways to get you into the system. So let me show you two different ways that you can get started from here. So I'm going to go ahead, jump back into the system, and so here we are. And so I wanted to show two different ways. The first is you have available to you a library, which is going to show you all the things that other individuals have saved out. So when I create a query, when I create a dashboard, when I create a, well, those would be the two more primary, a query or a dashboard, I can go ahead and save them for my future use, but I can also share them with other individuals, which is going to be really helpful because if I have gone through or somebody else has gone through the process of creating a query and done all the heavy lifting and the legwork, they can share that query with me and I can utilize it and kind of go from there. So what I see here now are all the different queries or things that people have saved out for me. And so I can utilize them. So maybe I want to go ahead. Let's see, do we have a good one in here? Actually, I'm going to go ahead and steal it from, let's see, what do I have under my name? If I have any good data in here. Actually, I'll go ahead and just use the app, which I'll show you in a second. So what I have here is an app that somebody has saved out, and now I can go ahead and access this. And so here I'm looking at an overview of visitor location. It's going to take a second to load. But what it's going to display once it's done is map information about where my visitors are coming from over the last 24 hours, traffic distribution, all kinds of kind of good stuff. And so I was able to find this information in my library, and I didn't have to do any, like I described earlier, any heavy lifting or any work to get there. So that's one way to take advantage of what other people have done, is to look for a query or a dashboard in the library that they've configured. The other way is to actually set up what we call an app. And what an app is in our world is it's essentially a shortcut that is going to provide you some queries and dashboards that we've created that will help solve some common use cases for log files that exist out there. So what we have in our app catalog is the top 50, 75 or so different log formats out there. So here we have a bunch of AWS stuff. We have a lot of Amazon because it's in alpha order. We have Azure. We have, I don't know, I mean, you can see them all here, Google Cloud stuff, Jenkins, Kubernetes. So we have a variety of different data formats out there that we recognize. And the way we recognize these, or not we, but in general, is log files are in a standard format. So an Apache message is going to be an Apache message, whether we're looking at it, whether it's coming from another environment, whether it's coming from an older version even. Apache's messages are all in the same format. And so what we can do with the app catalog is take advantage of that fact. So what we're going to do with this scenario here is, once again, we're new to Sumo Logic. We know that there's some Apache data because we just looked in the collection and did the query. And now we want to go ahead and see what is available in the app catalog. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Apache. And I'm going to start to see the things that are going to be provided to me. So here are some queries represented by the orange. And here are some dashboards represented by the green. If I click on the preview dashboards, I see, here's some dashboards that will be created for me. And, these look kind of cool. All right, I'd like to see my data in this environment. So what I'm going to do is click Add to Library. The first thing I'm going to do is just give the app a name. So using the Apache name is certainly sufficient. I already have an app called Apache, so I'm just going to call it Apache JB for my initials. And then I'm going to specify what source category of data do I want the system to bring into this app. And so I'm going to specify that Labs Apache Access that we're going to be playing with today. And I'm going to go ahead and verify and click Add to Library. System's going to take a second or two. But what it's doing now is it's taking that source category, it's taking the queries that I think are going to be valuable to Apache users, and it's putting them all together. And so now what we have here are a bunch of queries and a bunch of dashboards that have been created that I can utilize. So let's say I want to go ahead and look at visitor location information related to my Apache data. I click on it, and now that data is being generated, or the graphs rather, or the maps are being generated using that set of data, and now I have access to them. And so now I'm looking at my live real data with Apache queries that I utilized, that Sumo Logic created for me, and I didn't have to do any of that heavy lifting, any of that heavy work. And so this is a really good way that you can go in, get into Sumo Logic, and start taking advantage of the data and the formatting without even writing a query. And so at this point, we've yet to really write a query line, but we've outputted some really good data, or some really good views rather. And so that's going to be helpful for you. That app catalog will be a great starting point. Let's go ahead and jump back into the slide deck. So we just looked at the shared content, and then we looked at the app catalog. And then if you were doing the hands-on labs, which I would certainly encourage you to do later, at this point of the demo or the presentation, you would then start to do some of the lab work that I did. So like I said, I'd certainly encourage you to do so on your own time, and I'll make sure to point out where that is located in the environment a little bit later. So the next part is query syntax. So let's actually go ahead and just dive in, and we'll come back to this slide. But let's just show how the query syntax and works. So let me go ahead and. So what I'm going to do is a new log search. And so when I do a new log search, I'm brought to this screen, which is going to allow me to do a log search. And in this window right here is where I would start to enter my query. So let's say I want to start with a very simple query. I want to search for the string of Mozilla. So I type Mozilla and hit enter. At this point, what's happening is the system is now looking for that keyword or that string of Mozilla, specifically over the last 15 minutes. And when it finds it, it's going to display the results down here, bolded. And so here's Mozilla. And so what we're looking at are just wherever the string of Mozilla occurs. At this point, we're not looking for the browser type of Mozilla or the user agent string. We're just saying, if you find those 6 letters in a log message, bring them back to me. And so we see over the last 15 minutes, there's been about 175,000 results that have Mozilla in there. Important thing to note about the search window itself is that it is case insensitive. So capital and lowercase, still going to bring you the same results. So that's one thing that's important to note about the query window. Let's see, what else should we point out on this screen? Time. Time's an important feature within Sumo Logic. So by default, the query will run for the last 15 minutes of data. So it's going to go ahead and say, go 15 minutes back and grab all the data and find that which matches. But you have some other options in regards to time because you're not always going to want to do just 15 minutes. So let me show you some of the other options. If you click on the time window or selector, you have relative times, which are predefined time periods that we've created. So kind of logical time periods, last 15 minutes, last 60 minutes, last 3 hours, last 24 hours, yesterday, et cetera, et cetera. You have custom, where you can use more of a calendaring feature. So you can go ahead and say, I want to look for data from October 8th through October 12th, and from October 8th at 2 a.m. to October 12th at 5 a.m. and get very specific. The other option you have, and you can kind of see it up here, is this minus syntax. So what you can do is, if I want to look for the last 45 minutes of data, do minus 45M, which will look for 8:49 to 9:34 local time being the last 45 minutes. If I want to look for the last 4 days, minus 4D, which is going to look for the last 4 days, so from the 12th to the 16th. And then what I can also do, one last thing with this time, is I can do the minus to represent a period of time. So what I can do is I want to do the last 45 minutes to the last 30 minutes. 30 minutes. And what this is going to do is specifically pull the time period from just about 8:50 to 9:05, that 15-minute window specifically. So that's an option. Another option, one more option related to time, is to use the receipt time. So by default, the time that you're going to be using will be the time that is being parsed out or extracted from the log message itself. So each log message will have a time in it, or should have a time in it. And if so, we're going to utilize that time in the results. You have the ability to use the receipt time, which is basically going to say, instead of using the time from the log message, use the time that the data was received or ingested. And so that would be a different time. So for example, let's see, if you go ahead and you have 6 months of data, worth of data, past data, and you ingest it right now at this very second, I can go ahead and not use the receipt time and look for the last 6 months of data, look for the last 5 months of data, the last 4 months, etc., and find my data in there. Or I can use receipt time and say, just look in the last 5 minutes or so. Because if you look in the last 6 months, it's not going to find that data because that data was just loaded. So you just have a couple options. Do you want to use the time that was pulled from the log message or when the data was ingested? And based on the use case, the answer of what to use when may be appropriate in different use cases. Let me see, I think we had a question. So let me see if I can find it easily here. Let's see. Could one do a general search for multiple failed login attempts? Sure, absolutely. We won't go into that specifically. Actually, level 4 will be really helpful with that, where we start to discuss some security features. But absolutely, you could do multiple attempts. So let's go ahead and keep going here. So what I want to do now is I want to expand my search out a little bit more. Now, instead of just looking for Mozilla, what I want to do is look for Mozilla, but I want to look for specifically related to the source category equal to labs Apache access. So what I did right now is I'm saying, go ahead and look specifically only at Lab Apache Access data and the string of Mozilla. There's an implied end here, so this and no end are the same thing. And so what it's doing now is it's pulling all those source categories that have Lab Apache Access data with the string of Mozilla. And I see my results went from about, what was it, 175,000 or so down to 54,000. And so now I'm looking just at those specifically that match the criteria. But let's go ahead and actually let's turn off use receipt time. Let me go back to minus 15 minutes. And let me describe some more of what's going on the screen. Over here on this kind of a task bar, if you will, you have a couple different options. The first, in no particular order, is save as. So you create your query and you want to save it, you can go ahead and do so. Now, certainly we'd encourage you to save your queries. Your tabs that you create will persist when you log out. However, that's not a recommendation or a suitable solution for or replacement for saving your tabs. So just want to point that out that you should save periodically because saving is always a good thing. You can bookmark your tabs. So what I can do is I can bookmark this and, oh, I didn't save it. Fair enough. So let me go ahead and save it. Use this original name. And then now that I've saved it, now I can bookmark it. And now it will show up in my bookmarks like a favorite. Or it should show up. I think it'll show up in a second or two. There it is. So now it's accessible. Now I can have kind of one-click access to it. The other options here, share. So let's say you create this query and you're done with it or you want to pass it on to somebody else. Click the share button. And you're going to have a couple options here. The first is you're going to get to decide who do you want to share this with. So within your organization, do you want to share this with specific people? Maybe I want to share this with, who's in here? I want to share this with the other Josh at our organization, and I want to share this with Alex. I can go ahead and do so and say they have view only to this query. I can go ahead and provide roles so that we have the idea of role-based access control or RBAC. Also discussed in level 3, but this is how you can set it up for a query. So I could say, you know, I only want my administrators and my analysts accessing this query. I don't want my I don't want my account executives going near this. So I can do that. The other option I have is to provide somebody in the organization with this either URL or this code snippet. And by doing so, particularly with the code snippet is even cooler, I can take that code snippet, paste it into my query window. So let me go ahead and do a new query, paste that code in, hit enter. And what's going to happen is that entire segment of code with the time period, with the map option or graphing options, whatever I've set up, is now going to be provided to somebody. And so this is really a useful way to share queries in that I can take that code, put it into a Slack message, give it to somebody else, they put it into their query window, and now we're both looking at the same exact code with the same time selection and the same everything, and we can then collaborate or do whatever we need to do. So that's going to be helpful to share that out. The other option, pin, what pin is going to do is when you run your query, some queries are going to be very quick. Some queries are going to take longer to return based on the amount of data you're bringing back and, well, a wide variety of different options on why things take longer than others. But what you can do is you can start a query, click pin, leave the Sumo Logic environment, log out of the browser even, and then the next time you come in, that pin will ideally be finished querying and those results will be available for you. And so it's basically kind of a way to trigger a query, let it start running, and then go do something else and come back to it and get those results. And then finally, you have LiveTail. What LiveTail is going to do is allow you to utilize like a tail function in a Unix environment. So what I do is I'm going to click on LiveTail. It's going to bring my query into the tail. And then I'm going to see in real time as my data is being ingested and matches the query, I'm going to see that displayed here. And so I'm seeing in real time exactly what I just tried, that data that's being ingested that matches the pattern of this source category and this string of Mozilla. Now, one thing about LiveTail to keep in mind is if you decide to utilize it in a real-world environment, oftentimes you'll be ingesting gigs and gigs of data, gigabytes of data, and as a result, this screen can become very full of information, and it ultimately will end up looking like the Matrix, where you just have data and characters scrolling by very quickly. We also have a command line interface for the live tail. So if you want to utilize it, you may want to take advantage of that. So I just wanted to point out those couple options. So let's go ahead now and dive into, let's go back to our query, but let's go ahead and dig in a little bit deeper. So here was the query I was just working on. Let me just go ahead and kind of reset it, and now we're back to where we were. So now with this data, I'm just going to let it run there. It's just about done. So what I'm going to do now, and let me go ahead and just steal one snippet of code. Here we go. Sorry about that. I should have had that set up, but let me go ahead and show what I'm trying to demo. So what I want to do now is I want to start to pull pieces of information from my log message. So here's my log message. Here's another log message, but they're all have Apache access, so they're all going to have that same format. And within the log message, and even if I don't know much about Apache access messages, which I certainly wouldn't expect everybody to know, I can see some, visually just see some information in here. So here's an IP address, pretty clear. Here's some date and time information. So here's the year, here's the month, here's the day, hour, minute, second, time zone. We have URL information about the website or the location that the user was coming from. We have status code information. We'll play with the status codes in a little bit. You may have seen status codes if you've ever gone to a page and get a page cannot be found or file not found, you get a 404. Conversely, if you get to a page successfully, you get a 200. So we'll play with those status codes in a few minutes. And then there's some other information. You get the size of the message, you get a referrer link, and you get user agent or browser agent information about the type of browser you use to get to the website. So all that information is displayed within each log message. And so the question or the goal here is, let's say we want to start to parse out or pull those IP addresses or any of that information. How do we do it? A couple different ways. Let me show you one. And first one I'm going to show is regex. So what regex is going to allow you to do, many of you may have used regex before. Many of you who may have know of regex might be rolling your eyes saying, I hate regex, why are you introducing it? But let me show you why we use it and why it's supported by the system. That being said, it's not the only way. We know regex is very finicky, very picky. So if you don't want to utilize regex, I'll show you some other ways to get the same information. But regex is a good way to start. So what regex is doing, and it's not a Sumo Logic thing, it's I guess an international standard at this point, is you're going through and you're saying, I want to start doing some pattern matching. And so what we're doing with the second line is saying, okay, we want to parse out a field, and we're going to use regex to parse out or pull that field. The field we want to pull out is IP address, or more specifically IP underscore address. And the way we're going to recognize that field is to use this syntax. And this syntax here is saying, look for number, dot number, dot number, dot number. When you find that, that will be an IP address. And more specifically with the regex, it's saying, look for a digit between 1 to 3 characters, dot 1 to 3 characters, dot 1 to 3 characters, so on and so forth, which this pattern will match. So now if I click start, the system is going to look for this pattern, and when it finds it, it's going to create a field for IP address. So let's go ahead and click start and verify that it's doing what it says it should. And so now I see that down here. So I see my IP address, and I see the message. So for each message, I have a corresponding IP address. So IP address, IP address, IP address, IP address, whoops, so on and so forth. And I did not mean to do that, so let me just go ahead and get rid of that. And so that's one way to go ahead and start to pull these IP addresses. But as I mentioned, regex is very picky, it's very finicky, it's very case sensitive, it's very annoying for some people. And so we wanted to show some other ways that you can get this information. So let me go ahead and show a secondary way. And what I'm going to do with this 2 slashes is I'm commenting off the line or turning off the line. So essentially I'm saying, ignore this line. So now when I click start, we're just going to be running this first line. And so now we're back to kind of square run where we have all those Mozilla messages, but now we're going to go ahead and parse them again, but in a different way. The way we're going to do so in this case is we're going to take advantage of the UI. And so what we're going to do is we're going to be able to highlight a log message and then say, we want this part to be a IP address, this part to be a time, and let's go ahead and do that right now. So I'm going to take my log message and I'm going to highlight it. And I'm going to click off and I'm going to click parse to selected text. When I do, I'm going to be brought to a new UI environment. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and using the UI, I'm going to start to parse out and pull out those portions of the fields that I want to create. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to say this portion here, that's an IP address. So I'm going to highlight it, click to extract this value, and I'm going to call it an IP. I can call it an IP address. I can call it IP underscore address. I'm going to want to use something that makes sense to me, makes sense to other people if they use it. So something, somewhat logical. And I'm going to keep going. Now at this point, I could say this is the year, this is the month, this is the day, this is the hour, so on and so forth. But for this query and for this demo, you know what? I don't really care about that, segmenting time in that specific manner. So I'm going to just take the whole thing, and I'm just going to call it time. And I'm going to keep going. And I'm going to take this portion right here, and this is the URL. And a couple more here. I'm going to take this portion here. I'm going to call that the status code, which is those 404s, those 200s. A couple more. I'm going to take this little guy here. I'm going to call that the size. And only have one comma in there. And then finally, kind of with the same thing like I did with time, I have a refer, I have a user agent, but for this query, I don't really care about that. So I'm just going to take the whole thing, and I'm just going to call it miscellaneous. And when I click submit, now I'm going to have that query or that parse statement listed in my query. So what the system is going to do, and I haven't done it yet, I need to click start for it to actually do it, but before I do, I'll just go ahead and explain what's going on. Essentially, the system is going to pull up our Apache Access messages. It's going to look for the first portion of the message. When it finds it, it's going to call that an IP address. It's then going to look for a space. It's then going to look for a dash. It's going to look for a space. It's then going to look for another dash. It's then going to look for a space. It's going to find an open bracket. Whatever's in that open bracket, that it will call time, and so on and so forth. So now when I click start, now I have all those fields created for me. So here are my IPs, here are that miscellaneous stuff, here's my size, my status code, URL, et cetera, et cetera. And so now I can go ahead and start to utilize these fields and report on them. So I can go ahead and do something like, let's say I want to count all the status codes. I can do a new line, do a pipe to separate the lines, and do count by status code. And when I do so, now something new is going to happen. Since I'm doing count, I'm doing some sort of mathematical function, the aggregates tab is now displayed for me. And so now instead of just seeing my messages, I see the aggregates, which is that summation of the results that I requested. So now I see over the last 15 minutes, there's been 30,200 status codes, 1,000 404s, et cetera, et cetera. And now I can start to build them up on my query. And I will, but I'm going to just pause and go back one more time because I showed you how to use regex to pull out or parse a field. I showed you how to use the parse anchor or the UI to pull out a field. I want to show you one more way. So I'm going to go ahead once again and comment off these lines. So I'm kind of back to square one. So let's go ahead and just verify. Just running Labs, Apache Access, and Mozilla should get, what is it, about 45,000 results, which I do. And now I want to go ahead and once again pull out that IP address. Now, when I do, or before I do, you'll notice because I'm pointing it out, over here I have what's called a field browser. I have a question. Let me go ahead and just pop it up. So the question was, is there a text file for status codes and what they mean? There certainly is. It's a international standard, so for today's purposes, you don't really need to get bogged down. We're just using them as a field that you may want to parse out and start to segment. So if you go ahead and do just a Google search for status codes, you'll see the list of them. I think there's 100 of them or so. They're all very specific on what they indicate, but like I said, we'll just be using them kind of at a high level just to gather information. But so what we have here in this field browser here are some fields. So we have the time and the message of the message, which we always get. And then we have some other fields in here. So we have the collector, we have the source category, the source host. And if you remember from that, actually I'll pull it up real fast because you probably forgot. Those are some of the predefined metadata tags that we create. But if I go back to the data, there's an IP field here. And if I mouse over it or click on it, I see a bunch of IP values. I see the count, the percentage of those IPs. And the question is, or hopefully you're asking yourself, is how does Sumo know what an IP is? We haven't told it to look for an IP using regex or to look in the UI for this format. And what's happening is the system is taking advantage of what's called a field extraction rule. And what the field extraction rules is essentially parsing that setup prior to ingestion so that when the data gets ingested or comes into the system, then we parse out the field automatically. And so let me show you an example. There should be one set up here, I hope. Yep, there's a couple. So here, let's see, do I have my Apache data? Where is it? Ah, here it is. So what I have here is a very simple, very simple field extraction rule, and I should create a better one for demo purposes, but we still see what's going on, where we're saying, okay, look for this set of data. When you find that set of data, the first thing that you find in that message will be an IP address. You could then continue and say, then you'll find the time, then you'll find the status code, and so on and so forth. But once any data that gets ingested for Lab Apache Access, the system is automatically going to know how to find an IP address. So setting up field extraction rules will help you with that, and we would strongly encourage you to do so. It's really one of the better things you can do for the system and for your users is set up this rule. And the reason why it's so advantageous is, one, they don't now have to parse out or find those fields. It's done for them. The other thing is it uses then a standard naming convention. So everybody will now be calling an IP, versus somebody might end up calling it a unique identification number, which would be a valid name for it, but wouldn't really be a common name that people might use in your organization. That being said, if you do use a name that's kind of out of the ordinary, you can force people to use it as well. So field extraction rules, really cool, really helpful. Strongly encourage you to set them up. But let's go ahead and get back to where we were. So at this point, what we're doing now is let me clean this up a little bit because it's a bit messy. So what I have right now is I have my parse statement using the parse UI or parse anchor, and I'm doing a count by status code. So let's just verify I'm getting my data, and I am. So now we're seeing the different status codes and the different counts. Now, this is helpful information. I'm starting to see that there were a lot of 200s, which is a good sign. A fair amount of 404s, which is a bad sign, and like I said, a bunch of stuff in between. And this is over the last 15 minutes, which is helpful. But let's say I want to start to look at trends over time. What if I want to look at this in minute segments? I want to see how many status codes, 200 status codes there were at 9:53, and at 9:52, and 9:51, and so on and so forth. What I can do is I can introduce the idea of a time slice. And so what I'm going to do is add that right here. And what I'm doing with this line is I'm saying, and as I type it, the system is going to be smart enough to do a search ahead and find what I might be typing and help me type it in. And it also gives me a definition or an explanation of what that feature is. And so what I have here is it's about to utilize the time slice, which is segment data by time periods. So I'm going to say, I want to do a time slice for 1 minute. And like I said, show me my data at 9:52, show me my data at 9:53, and 9:51. And so let me go ahead and now count by time slice. And so when I click this, now I should get what I'm expecting or hoping to get. And I do, and let me go ahead and just clean up the screen a little bit. And so what I have down here is now at 9:40, there were 6503 status codes. At 9:46, there were 1700 200s. At 9:39, so on and so forth. So this is good. It's not in chronological order though, so let me go ahead and do that. So what I'm going to do is very simply put a new line that says order by time slice. And more specifically, I want to put that order in ascending order. And so I'm going to let that run for a second. The question was, when is it necessary to have an underscore? That's a very good question. Glad you asked it. So this is going to be a little bit of trial and error, but let me try and give you an overview of when to utilize it, because there is a logic that goes behind it. So it's whether or not you're going to be using an operator or whether or not you're going to be using the results of the operator that will determine when you use the underscore. So in this time slice, we're saying use the operator of time slice and take our data and split it into 1 minute chunks. Here we're going to use the underscore because we want to now take the results of those 1 minute chunks and display them along with status codes. So I heard somebody came up with this in another call, kind of an interesting way to thinking about it is to think of underscore and non-underscores as nouns and verbs. If you want to use the verb, you want the operator to do something, you would not use an underscore. If you want to show the results, then you would use the underscore, and that's why we have an underscore for time slice. Now, we don't have an underscore for status code because that is a field only. There's not an operator called status code. If there was, then we probably would need to use the underscore. So you'll see through some more examples I show when to use it, when not to. But that's a good example or explanation, I think, is kind of verb noun usage. So let's go ahead and so I just click start. And so now what I get, and I'm going to hide the histogram here just to clean up the screen a little bit. And so what I have now is my times are starting to be grouped together. So here are all my 940s, here are all my 941s, here are all my 942s, and so on and so forth. So this is good info, but it's still difficult to interpret. What I'd ideally like to see, and I will show because like I said earlier, I've done this demo a few times, is I'm going to go ahead and look at this in a more of a familiar look of time slices being in a column and have our status codes as a row. So essentially looking like Excel or transposing the data. So since I want to go ahead and transpose, I need to go ahead and introduce the transpose operator. So once again, as I type it, it's going to tell me what it's going to do. And so I'm going to say transpose. What do I want to call my row? I want my row to be made up of my time slices, and I'm going to use the underscore because I want to use the results of the time slice operator. And then I want my column to be made up of status codes. And whoop, should be an underscore code. And now when I run this, this should now look like Excel. And so what I get here is all my times down the left-hand side, all my status codes, or at least the status codes that have been in my logs over the last 15 minutes up at the top. And then at the cross section, I get the counts. So now I can clearly or easily see at 944, there were this many 200s, which are good, and this many 404s, which are bad. And so now I can start to compare them, and we'll actually do that a little bit right now. So like I said, this is good information, but it's not that easy for me to, as a human, to digest. And so what I want to do is use some of the charting operations or features to help me view this data in a different view. And so up here, I have a variety of different charting operators that I call them operators, charting options I can use. So maybe I want to see this data in a bar chart. Line chart. This line chart's pretty good. Now, what I'm seeing here is over the last 15 minutes, the count of those status codes in minute chunks. So I see here at 9:45, 9:46, 9:47, so on and so forth. Now, this data, like you said, this is pretty good, but the problem I'm having with this view is I can't really see what's going on with these other status codes down here. Status code 200, pretty clear. I can see the peaks and valleys. It's kind of dominating the screen. 304, same idea. I can see those peaks and valleys pretty well, but I can't see those other ones. So I have two options here on cleaning up this chart. The first, and no particular order, the first is I can go into the legend of the chart and click on the values that I do not want to display. So I can say, you know what, turn off the 200, turn off the 304, and now my chart is cleaner because those two are removed, the scale gets adjusted, and now I can really see those peaks and valleys of all those other status codes. So that's one way to handle that scenario and solution. The other way is I can go into my query and create a line that says, and let me go ahead and just type it in here, add a line that says, you know what, where the status code is equal to 200, or the status code is equal to 304, which is the other one I turned off. And what I did with that exclamation point is say, bring all the data back where status code is not equal to 200 or 304. So if there's a status code that's not equal to those, bring them back, otherwise leave them out. And so now when I click start, now the 200 and 304 are left out entirely of my results. And the graph is now adjusted to make it something, like I said earlier, more just easier to digest and to see those peaks and valleys. Cool, so let's go ahead and one other thing I just want to show in here because it is helpful. When I look at the tabular results, and I can actually do this in two different ways, export this data out. So I can go ahead and take the table that I created and export it out, or I can go to the messages themselves and export them out into a CSV, which is really helpful because I can retain these fields that I created and provide this to somebody else that might need to use a CSV or ingest it into another system or what have you. But now I can use those fields I've created, and I can now take that CSV and there'll be a field or a row, or actually a column for IPs, a column for sizes and status codes, and then, like I said, ingest them into another system. Let's go ahead and let me just jump back into the slide deck just to make sure I'm kind of on track. So let me actually skip through some of those. So query syntax, I've been demonstrating it, but certainly important that you understand how it works. Basically, we're taking those keywords and operators, we're using the pipes to separate them, and we're building them on top of one another. It's important to note that the query is essentially, and building on top of one that kind of describes it, but the query is you're going to click start. The query is going to run. It's going to take the results from the first line, bring them back, then take those into the second line, bring them back, then take them to the third line. So each line, it's gathering data and formatting it as appropriate. And so here's an example. So in the first line, we're using the metadata to specify, okay, we just want to look at Lab Apache Access data and Mozilla. So we're using metadata and keywords to start to say, instead of giving me my entire index of data, just give me this stuff. Then we're using the parse to say, okay, now that you have this data, go ahead and start to extract fields. And you can find the URL located in between the GET and HTTP. And after the HTTP, that's going to be a status code, and so on and so forth. So now the system is learning what those fields are called or where those fields are located. In the third line with the filter, we're starting to say, okay, now that you know what a status code is, now just bring the status codes back that I want. So in this case, I'm saying, just bring me back status codes that match 5, a 501, a 502, a 503, etc. If it's a 404 status code, I don't care about it in this case. We're going further. Now that we have all those status codes that match 5, let's do a count by them. Let's do a sort by them. So that's where that aggregation is coming in of doing that count. And then the sort and the limit are where you start to format your data. So you're saying, all right, now that I have all the results back, just show me 3 of them, or just format them and sort them by the count or what have you. And so these are the steps that make up a query. Now, not all these steps are going to be required. You might not need to format your data. If you're using a parse, if you're using regex, you won't even need, if you're using a field extraction rule, sorry about that, you won't even need to do the parse statement because your fields would already be determined. So while this is a good guide, it's not necessary that you have all these components within each query. It is important to note, though, that the query builds downward using the keywords and all the components to narrow your scope. So what I like you to envision, and this picture kind of shows it, is a very big funnel. And at the top of the funnel, you have a very wide mouth, and you start pushing all your data into the top of the funnel. And at the bottom of the funnel is just the good stuff you want to come out, just your results or just the data that's going to be relevant to you. And so using all the syntax, you're going to start to take that data and format and smush it together and only have that goodness come out. And so you start with the metadata and keywords like we just went over. You're going to use the parse, variety of different parse options, but you will want to tell the system, hey, this is this type of field. You're going to use the filter to start to say, only show me where these results occur, or only other types of things. The aggregates, as discussed a few times, that's where you're going to start to use the count, the average, percentage. Basically, any of the mathematical stuff would be an aggregate. And then the format is you're just kind of cleaning it all up. So you're going ahead and you're saying, just give me the top, or just give me transposing those results to, as it says here, to display the desired results succinctly. Good, so let's go ahead and now let's look at some of the advanced analytics features. So let's go ahead and jump back into the app. And let's go ahead and look at outliers first. So let me do, actually, I may need to log out of this account. Content. Yeah, let me log out of this account and log in as another one. I apologize for that. I apologize. I should have had that set up. So what I'm doing, just logging into a different account that has some queries that are already created that will help me demonstrate some of the features of the system, but also save a little bit of time. So let's see. Where are they? Here they are, under training. Sorry about that. Training queries. And then the first one I wanted to go over was outlier. So what we're doing with the outlier here is, and I'll kind of walk through what the code's doing and talk about it. And when I show the graphical view, that will really kind of explain it. But so what I'm doing here is I'm saying, okay, look at my Lab Apache Access data and look for status codes equal to 404. So we're only interested in 404 status codes. We're doing a time slice. So we're saying take our data from the last 60 minutes and show it or display it in 1-minute chunks. The third line is saying, okay, take those status codes, which are only going to be 404s, and just call them server error count. So now what we see here down below And let me get rid of the last line, just I'll bring in the outlier in the next step. So what I now see is at 5:49, whatever time zone this is in, don't know which one, we see that there were 130 server error counts or 130 404s. At 5:26, there were 162, so on and so forth. Now with the outlier, what I'm doing, and as I started to explain earlier in the demo, is I'm taking it and starting to develop a threshold that is going to be considered acceptable. So using some of the mathematics up here, I'm not going to go over them might as well go over them quickly. So what we're doing is we're saying how many trailing data points we want to utilize, how many standard deviations, those kind of mathematical things, ultimately determining an acceptable range. So what I'm saying here is at 5:09, I had 111, actually let me scroll up. At 5:08, I had 144 server error counts or 404s. Using the mathematics, a range was determined to be between 91 and 195. Since I'm within that range, that's considered acceptable, and so that's good. Down here at 5:11, I was expecting between 90 and 158 404s. However, we have 164, and as a result, the server error count indicator is 1. Now in this view, I can kind of see what's going on, but I really can't get a great feel for it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on one of the other graphing options I have. And you'll notice, although you may not because it's kind of hard to see, I actually can't utilize any other graphing operators or options except for this one here, which is the line chart. It's the only one available to me. So I clicked on it. It's now gathering the data. And what it's now showing, and hopefully you can see this, sometimes it's a little hard to see on a screen sharing environment, but what I have here is a dark blue line representing for each minute the count of 404s, or server error count. And the light blue cloud is representing the upper and lower threshold of those things that have taken place. And so what I see here, once again, threshold was determined between 90 and 148. It was 162. We got more 404s than were expected, and so we display that as an outlier with the pink triangle. Over here, we actually had less expected. We were expecting between 111 and 142. We only got 97. Now, in my mind, having less 404s than expected is kind of a good thing. So what I can do with this direction is I could say, don't show me things that were above and below the upper threshold limit. Just show me those that were above. And so what I'm going to do is just modify my direction. And now all those minuses are going to fall off. And so now I'm just going to see over the last 60 minutes the times when the 404s were greater than were expected. And so we see that there were, 6 of them over the last hour. Now what I'll do a little bit later is take this and make this into an alert, but I'll keep that kind of in my back pocket and show it to you in just a few more minutes. But let me show you another useful operator. So let me go ahead, jump back into my training and GeoLookup. There it is. So what this is going to do is, once again, we're going to look at our Lab Apache Access data. We're going to go ahead and pull out the IP address. So we're saying look for the Lab Apache Access message. And let me clean this up again. That first portion of the message, that will be the IP address. And so then we see our IP addresses in our messages. So here's our IP. Now the next line, this third line, is using the GeoLookup table. And so what we're doing here is we're saying, okay, take the IP address, which we're calling source IP, and compare it to the IP that exists within the GeoLookup. What you can extract from that information is various geographic information about the user or about the IP. So when an IP visitor occurs, different information about that IP is publicly available, assuming it's a public IP. So if you go to a website, I know assuming you're near that IP, I know the city, the state, the zip, geographic information about where you're coming from. Country code, latitude and longitude are also one. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying, okay, here's my IP address, or the IP address that visited me, and pull out the latitude and longitude that correspond to those. So the IP address here corresponds to this latitude and longitude. With this next line, I'm just saying count those up. So I'm saying, once again, do the math and add them all up. And so what I see here is there were 7,000 visitors over the last 15 minutes coming from this latitude, this longitude. 6,000 or just under 7,000 from this latitude, longitude, and so on and so forth. Now, if I'm really good at geography, I might know that 37 latitude and minus 122 longitude is someplace in the world. I'm not very good at geography. Most of us aren't. And so Sumo can help us here. I click on the map icon, and it's taking those IP addresses and it's now overlaying those onto a map. And now I can see specifically that there were, let's say we're just focusing on the US, there were this many US visitors. And I can start to drill down on these. So what I can do is say, all right, it looks like there's about 16,000 visitors coming out of kind of this New York Northeast area. Let me drill down. All right, well, actually, there's only 15,000. Let me keep drilling. Oh, well, there's really only 13,000. And then it kind of gets interesting. 13,000, 13,000, 13,000. If I go in a little bit more, I actually see it looks like there's a breakout of people coming from New York versus New Jersey. So I guess there's two different data centers very close to one another that are being utilized for our demo data, but they are different regions. So that map is really helpful because, well, one, just because it's helpful, it's really a clean view into seeing your data. You can imagine putting this up, like I said earlier, in a command center or a NOC environment and on a big screen seeing as your visitors come in from different regions. And then also as they come in from regions you don't expect. So if all of a sudden I get a count over here in Russia or a count in China, that might be curious to me. Now, maybe it is a legitimate user, maybe it's somebody using a VPN, although that IP would not be China. There might be reasons for it, but it then gives me the onus or the reason to go investigate and make sure, that person coming from Russia, are they legit? Yes or no? If they are, do whatever action. If they're not, certainly do another option. So I wanted to show those as just a couple different features that are available to you. There's a lot more, but those are just kind of wanted to present those. Let's see, a couple more things I wanted to show. Let's go ahead and jump into, what should we show now? Let's go ahead and do the log compare, log reduce, because those are kind of cool. So I'm going to go ahead, jump back into my data, and this time I'm going to pull up some different data just to get a different set of data. So I'm going to go ahead and look for snort data, which is security data. And what this data is going to show us, and it's now pulled, so for the last 60 minutes, there's been 6,000 security events. And we see some of those events detailed in here. So I see web application attack, attempted information leak, web application attack, sensitive data. So I see a bunch of different events that have taken place over the last hour. Now, once again, if I want to go ahead and start to figure out what events have taken place, I can go through and start to manually look at 6,000 messages, 252 pages of logs. But, as described a few times, that's not a good use of a system, not a good use of your time either. So first, I can do log reduce. And as a reminder, what log reduce is going to do is it's going to take all those log messages over the last hour and group them together looking for common patterns. So it's going to take a moment to do so, and then it's going to display. And so what I see here is over the last hour, there's been 3,000 attempted information leaks, 600 sensitive data classifications, 333 detection of network scans, so on and so forth. So this is a good way for me to start to see my data and see, is there anything in here that's I want to dig into further. If I do, I can click on these numbers to actually see the log messages that correspond. So let's say I want to see actually see the attempted denial of services. If I click on the two, it will show me those two attempted denial of services that have happened over the last 60 minutes. Just had a question here related to geo-lookup. Can we differentiate VPN versus international IPs? So we can only evaluate the IP that's provided in the log format. So if you are able to distinguish in those logs between one versus the other, we can help you with that. But typically, you would just provide the IP and we would just look it up. We wouldn't be able to associate with a VPN or not. So if your log messages are formatted that way, yeah, you can take advantage of that. So what I see now here are those two specific messages related to the attempted denial of services. Now, let me take a step back and let's go back to my set of data. Actually, let me do this. So I'm back with my, over the past hour, here's my data grouped together. And so now I'm looking at, once again, there's been this many events. Now I want to introduce log compare. And what log compare is going to do, when I click it, it's going to do a time shift for 24 hours by default. But what it's doing is it's doing a log compare for now, it's doing a log compare for 24 hours ago, and it's comparing the results. So essentially we're doing a log compare for the past hour. We're going back 24 hours to yesterday morning, or yesterday at about 10 o'clock Pacific time, and doing the same thing. And so what we can start to see is now the occurrence or a frequency of things that have happened over time. So I see here between yesterday and today, there's been an increase by 1.5% of detections of a network scan. Well, that's interesting. Why are there more network detections today than yesterday? That might give me something to go on. There's been a decrease here by 9% or almost 10% of network Trojans were detected. Well, that sounds like a good thing. And then I have a couple other things here. So I have new. So these attempted denial of services are new today and did not occur yesterday in the same time period. Well, similarly, these last three things occurred yesterday during that time period, but did not exist today. And so this is a good way for you to start to compare time over time. So you might say, we had this many security events today, we had this many security events last Tuesday, and see, is this normal for a Tuesday, or is something going on that might need to dig into a little bit deeper. So this is a good way to start to compare time over time. Let's see, what do we want to show now? Let's go ahead and jump back to Outlier, and let's go ahead and start to show dashboarding. Actually, let me go into the slide deck real fast just to make sure we're kind of on the same page. So we looked at some of the advanced analytics. We just looked at lookup and outlier. Predict is available in the lab level 2, actually. So I'd certainly encourage you to play around with that. We looked at log reduce and log compare and the differences. One shows that needle in the haystack by identifying patterns. The other then takes that patterns and compares them with patterns in the past. We looked at LiveTail, showing you a real-time view of getting access to your logs. And then correspondingly, there would be lab components that would go along with this. Let's go ahead and look at dashboards and alerts. And I'm actually just going to dive into them and just show them. Like I said, I have some slides that correspond, but let me just go in here and start showing you kind of a real world example. So let's say I want to start, I've gone through the trouble of making this outlier of our 404s. This is good information, and I want to put this on a dashboard for both my own use and for other people to use. To do so, pretty simple, click the Add to Dashboard button. When I do so, I'm going to go ahead and give this panel a name. So what do I want to call this set of data or this graphical information? Once again, you're going to want to give it something that makes sense. I'm going to just stick with this name that I have of the example. And then you're going to decide, what dashboard do I want to save this to? Maybe you have an existing dashboard that you want to utilize. Maybe you have a new one. I'm going to use a new one just for demo. And not really going to get creative with the naming, just going to use my initials twice. And then I'm going to decide, where do I want to save it? I'm going to save it to the root directory. And so now I have a dashboard with a panel here. And so here I have the panel of the outliers. I can go ahead and start to modify this screen, this dashboard. So I can say, maybe I want this to be bigger. That's a little bit better. Maybe I want to toggle the theme. I want to turn it black instead of white. That's better on the eyes. Maybe I want to add a text panel. So I want to add a panel here that says text test. This is an outlier. And so now I've created a dashboard. Maybe I want to modify this, put this on the left, this on the right. All right, that's pretty good. I like that, the way it's looking and the way it's suitable for me. So at this point, what I can do, certainly I can utilize this dashboard and reference it whenever I want, but I can also share it out in a similar way that I could share out queries, but with one change. So let me go ahead and click on share and show you the options. The first option, as I described earlier, I can say specifically I want Bob and Bill to have access to this dashboard, or I want specific roles. I want my administrator and my analyst to have access to it, so I can go ahead and do that. The other option I have, which is kind of unique, is I can take this dashboard, and assuming my administrator has given me the ability to do so, which is kind of a bit of an assumption, but giving admin rights, I can go ahead and share this dashboard out with people outside the organization in a share-only view. So what I can do is take this URL, give it to somebody, and if this dashboard is accessible outside my org, I can share it with anybody in the world. So anybody in the world that has this URL, they can view that dashboard. Now that's pretty powerful because you could inadvertently give it to somebody that you don't want. And so what we give you is the option to do whitelist only. So what you can do is in the admin console say, I only want to give those people coming from this IP address or this side or range access to this dashboard. So that's one option. And so that's a couple ways that you can share your data out or your dashboards out. Then the last thing I want to show is setting up searches. So let me go ahead and actually we can use our outlier example. So what I have here is, we're back to that outlier, and what I have here is showing those 404s when they exceeded what was expected. Let me just clean it up. Actually, I need this portion. So what I can do is I can go ahead and save as, and I showed you how to save the query earlier, which isn't new. But when I save as, I have an option to schedule this search. And what I can do now is I can have this search run periodically and grab those results and deliver them to me via email, via Slack, via other mechanisms. And let me show you how it's set up. I simply click schedule the search. I decide the frequency I want this to run. Do I want it to run real time? Do I want it to run every 15 minutes? Got a bunch of different time options. Let's say I want this to run every 15 minutes. And I want it to notify me every time a search is complete. So every 15 minutes, this query is going to run, and it's going to show me the amount of 404s that occurred during that time period. Or not the amount, but the outlier of the 404s. And so it's going to notify via email. I can be notified via some other options. So maybe ServiceNow. I have I'm using ServiceNow and I want to integrate with it. I can go ahead and connect there. I can set up a webhook. So if I'm using those Slack, those Twitter, Discord, any of those properties that use webhooks, I can take advantage of those here. And then the other thing I can do, which is kind of extreme but kind of cool, is I can have a script action run. So I can actually have a script run when, in this case, every 15 minutes. So maybe not the best example, but maybe, and I can actually use this for if the following condition is met, maybe if a certain amount of 404s occur, I have this server reboot. I have that script run, I can do so. And so those are some options with saving and scheduling a search that I certainly encourage you to use, because they set up that mechanism for you to be notified outside of Sumo Logic when something occurs, which is, like I said earlier, going to be really helpful. So you're not just sitting in there staring at a screen all day. Let's see, pretty much wrapping up here. So let's go back to slide deck, make sure we're kind of on track. Let's see. Yeah, let's go. So where do I go from here? Let me just go ahead and show within the interface rather than going through slides. So where do you go from here? There's a couple things that we would encourage you to utilize within the system. So the first is to just go to the Home tab. And when you go to Home, you'll have two options here. The one on the middle is a Learn tab. And what this is going to provide you is with the ability to learn more about Sumo Logic. So what we have in here are some videos that are going to be helpful as far as going through Sumo Logic and learning more about it. You'll have access to some of the tutorials. So this using Sumo Logic tutorial, I would encourage you to do. It's actually, we kind of went through all those steps here today. But I'd certainly encourage you to do it on your own. Set up Sumo Logic tutorial. This is actually the tutorial that corresponds with level 3. So would encourage you to do that as well if that's appropriate. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, we have a bunch of other help options. So we have links to our cheat sheets, which is going to show you a list of all the operators, which will be really helpful. Links to our documentation, community forum. Our community is really helpful because it allows you an opportunity to interact with other users of Sumo Logic and discuss ways you may be utilizing Sumo and creative queries, creative dashboards, creative solutions to getting the most out of Sumo. So I would encourage you to use the Sumo, visit the Sumo community. And then the other option in here is certification, which I wanted to give a plug for certification. We launched the certification program, I guess a year and a half ago now. What it allows you to do is take some security exams, certification exams to verify that you are skilled in Sumo, if you will. Each level, we have 4 of them, consists of preparation work, so a QuickStart webinar and a tutorial. The QuickStart webinar is what I just went through now. The tutorial is what you would go through. And then once you're done with that, you would take the exam. The exam is multiple choice exam. It's free for you, free for your organization. You get multiple attempts to pass. And what it's meant is, like I said, an opportunity for you to prove that you've learned about Sumo, prove to your organization. You walk away with a certification. You can put it on your LinkedIn. You've now learned a new skill. So it's beneficial for you as well. And then, like I was also alluding to, we have 4 different levels. So level 1 is what we did today, which is kind of the beginner or pro user level. Level 2 is power user, which is going to go ahead and actually start utilizing some of the queries we looked at. So that's going to be really helpful. Level 3 is administrative. I alluded to that a few times, but any of the administrative features, setting up collectors, setting up access, role-based access, all that, it falls under level 3. And then we recently launched a Sumo Security Power User exam, which is very similar to the Level 2 exam, except it's more security focused. So it's going to show you ways to look at multiple failed logins and get alerted when you have somebody log in from 2 different regions at the same time. So if I log in from China and I log in from the US within the same minute, maybe I want to get notified on that. And maybe there's a legitimate reason for it, but maybe it's something I get notified and then I verify, hey, was that person really on a VPN, or are we getting hacked, or what have you? So, so just wanted to introduce those. But so that's really what we wanted to cover today. So thank you everybody for attending. We'll go ahead and post this out for people to view in the future. But we'll also be running this webinar next month. And then just as a reminder, next week we'll be doing level 2 and level 3 webinar. So level 2, I believe we'll be doing next Tuesday, and I believe we're doing level 3 Sumo Power Admin next Thursday, same time. So thanks for everyone attending, and I hope you have a good day.